Then let me offer just a brief introduction. Phu is going to lead us this evening, and we have shaped this so that we can consider his book this evening and again next month. We may decide, more conversation is needed. There's so much in the book, and we know this was put together relatively quickly, so many have not had a chance to order the book or to read it yet. So we'll go through some content in ways that make it accessible to everyone and begin to unpack some of the really good liberation theology that's in it. And I just have a couple of words of introduction, and then we'll get going. Phu Luu immigrated with his family to the United States from Vietnam when he was 4 years old. He is a theologian, philosopher, and artist living in Houston, Texas. If theology is speaking about God, then Luu seeks to give new language and grammar to what theology has not yet said. That quote is taken from the flyleaf of Phu's book, Jesus of the East, Recovering the Gospel for the Wounded, which the Houston Chronicle named as one of the 10 best books of the quarantine year 2020. Since many of us are still in a state of semi-quarantine, I think that recommendation still holds. I wanted to say personally that I've known Phu since 1997. I did the math, that's actually a long time. When we were residents together at a hospital, chaplain resident at a hospital in Southeast Houston, we became fast friends that year because we shared a very similar sense of humor. I might add that not everyone else shared that sense of humor. Phu has always been a person of extraordinary curiosity and ability. I've known him as a very fine painter, poet, university professor, minister, photographer, philosopher, theologian, and most importantly, preparer of the strongest and best Vietnamese iced coffee I've ever had. So I could say a lot more, but I won't. Friends, will you just join me in welcoming my dear friend and our guide for this evening, Phu Luu.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys being here, gathering. Circular Congregation has a big part in my heart, my wife's heart also. We watch a few of your services during the beginning of the quarantine, and it's been very meaningful to us. So I'm glad to see you all here this evening. Please continue to send good thoughts our way in Houston, in the state of Texas, for all that's going on due to the storm. So there's still a lot of people without water, without plumbing, and they're just trying to recover from yet another disaster. And perhaps we will talk about some of that in this presentation, because that's also apropos to what we'll be talking about tonight. So hopefully you all can see the title of my presentation for this evening, Minjang and Other Liberative Theology. So I'll be talking about this term, Minjang, that's a Korean term, and then another term, Han, which is another uniquely Korean term. And just go through these slides, not spending too much time, but just trying to give y'all a overview of the language. Some of you have the book, Jesus of the East. Some of you don't, and that's all right. Hopefully this gives us some language to use, okay? So the origins of Minjang. The word Minjang means people's theology. And like I said, it originated in Korea. And the term came about in the 70s. is derived from this idea that Jesus ministered to the aklos, that's the Greek word in the Bible for crowds, okay, in particular. So if you read the Gospels, you will see that Jesus's work was mainly to the people, the crowds, the aklos. And like I said, during the 70s, Korean theologians and other leaders, both lay leaders and church leaders, decided that they would side with the oppressed, that they would take their theology from the safety of their church buildings out to where people were considered socially and economically and culturally oppressed. And these would be the workers. And I highlight the female union factory workers who were, there were a lot of them in Korea, struggling for their rights, the farmers and the urban poor. So Minjang was used mainly during this Yi dynasty, which took place between 1392 and 1910. And that term was used to exclude those who were not of the ruling class. And then when the Japanese came to occupy Korea in the early 20th century, okay, the term was used to talk about all those people except those who collaborated with the Japanese. So the people of Korea experienced this colonization, and some Koreans chose, like many colonizations, to side with the oppressors. And so this term was used to talk about the oppressed. The next term I want to talk about is the term Han. Okay, like I said, this is a uniquely Korean concept. However, the idea, okay, of Han is not uniquely Korean, and I'll talk about this. So in the scholarship, it talks about how can Minjang and Han be applied. Is it something that is only situated in Korea and the people of Korea, or is it something that can be applied to others? And my argument, of course, is that it can be applied in many ways, especially here in the United States. So the word Han can be defined as a sense of deep woundedness, a unjustified wound that cries out. I use that image of crying out that's taken from the Hebrew text. Most of you would know the story of Cain and Abel, and how Abel's blood seeped into the ground, and it cried out for justice, right? And so Han is that continual crying out for justice. Han grew out of this woundedness because of the colonization of Korea, and also the war, okay, in Korea. Some of you might remember there was a war in Korea that the United States was deeply involved in. When I started this work, and part of it was for my dissertation work, I found the connection between Han and Vietnamese Han, or Hoan Han. This Hoan Han is this sense of of hatred or animus. Okay, and so so the Korean word Han actually originated from a Chinese character, and so this word has been floating around Asia. So wherever there is deep woundedness, where there's deep hurt, where there's this sense of oppress that's driven into people's bodies, into the DNA of people, that seeks some kind of justice, is where we have Han. And so, of course, you can see it in some countries like Vietnam, where there has been this history of colonization by the Chinese, the Japanese, the French, and there was a war there also involving the United States of America. Okay, and so it's natural that we see this word creep up in the Vietnamese language. So Han is usually dealt with in two ways, and historically, this is done through the religion of shamanism in Korea. One is a ritual, what is called cut, a ritual performed by the shaman to drive Han away from the body or the person. And the second way is through art, through folk art. And this is a way of expression of taking Han and naming it and visualizing it, and helping people heal from Han. So before I was introduced, I was playing some blues, okay, for us to get situated. And I would, in some ways, talk about blues as American Han, okay, that deep-seated hurt that can only come out in that form of that art, the music we call the blues. The other side of Han, or the answer to Han, is the Korean word dan. Okay? And dan means to cut off. That's sort of the literal translation. And that can be seen in two ways. One way, it can be seen personally, sort of self-denial. So if I personally am the victim of hurt and woundedness, I could eliminate Han, or the spread of Han to others, by saying that I would not take my anger, my resentment, my bitterness out on someone else. And so in that way, it can be called self-denial. And another way, we can talk about dan as resistance, resisting, okay, the temptation to have those forces overpower us. Okay, and I like the term resistance because it's a more contemporary idea that some of us have been doing as Americans, especially through this past 4 years. But obviously, we have a longer history of resistance to stop, to say no to the continuation of Han. Okay, and so we see this reflected in something like the work of the pastor Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so the other way in which dan can be expressed is the breaking of the cycle of vengeance, and this can be done on a social level. So we're thinking about what ways can our society end the hurt, what ways can we restore, and this is where I talk about the idea of restorative justice. And as you know, there are different types of justice. There's, retributive justice. But what Don is trying to do is set up a system which we're calling restorative justice. So the response to Han is to heal the wounded and move the theological focus from the forgiveness of the sinner to the healing of the sin against. And so this is sort of the emphasis of my book, the main thesis in my book. I asked the question, why is it in Western theology and our Western liturgy, where we practice our theology, that the emphasis has often been on the sinner? How can the sinner receive forgiveness of their sin, but not the sin against? Okay, so what happens to the sin against? If we say that someone is a sinner, we have to assume that they sinned against something or someone, right? And most often that sin against has been God. But in our everyday lives, that's probably not the case. Okay, we do abhorrent acts to those around us. We do acts that are wrong, that are violent to the animals of this world, to species, and to our great planet Earth. Okay, and so we've sowed Han into others, and therefore they've become the sin against. And so here I just want to talk about other liberative theologies, as I promised. First of all, Latin American liberation theology, where the focus is on the liberation of the poor in Latin America. So the question is Minjang like Latin America theology, such as the theology of Gutierrez? And I would say yes and no. So whereas Latin America liberation theology focuses primarily on the poor, Minjang is multifaceted and works to restore those who have been affected by politics, by social economic factors, by cultural and ethnic factors also. So the Minjang are not only the poor, okay, but others who are oppressed. I would say the closest tie to Minjang we have is through Black liberation theology, where yes, Black liberation theology, the emphasis is on the Black Americans here in the United States and also abroad, but it's very multifaceted also. So in approaching Black theology, the theologian doesn't just say liberation comes through just the freedom of the poor. In other words, economics is not the only factor, right? So if we lift up African American people through just economic programs, that's not going to solve other issues that we understand are important issues, right? The issues of racism, the issue of white supremacy, the issue of social and class structures. And so where Minjang intersects the most is with Black liberation theology, and I'll show you some examples, which is fascinating. I'll not go through this slide, but these are other ways in which Minjang interacts with other liberative theology, feminist, womanist theology, queer theology, indigenous theology, and and environmental theology, which is so important because, and Jeremy knows, and you all know, you've done, you know, a lot of work in this, that the sin against is also often this planet, our resources, this earth that we all share, and so now we could deny the effects of being brutal to our environment all we want, but we can still suffer the results of that. We can suffer the harm that this earth is experiencing, and again, last week in Texas, it dropped to 18 degrees, and I've never experienced that all my life here in Texas. Okay, so this is really fascinating, and I don't know if many of you know of this African American writer by the name of Ida B. Wells. In fact, today it's just it's so fascinating, so great that I was driving home from work, from the school that I teach at, and I heard on the radio a show on Ida B. Wells and a book coming out about her life called, I think, Ida the Queen. So Ida B. Wells was a writer and a spokesperson against lynchings that took place in Memphis, and one lynching in particular that sort of inspired her work was one that appeared at this or happened at this grocery store called the People's Grocery Store there. It just happens to be called the People's Grocery Store. It was co-owned by 3 African Americans who were doing very well when they opened this grocery store, but their competition, a white grocer, was jealous and sent deputized sheriffs to ransack the store, destroy the store. A fight broke out, a gunfight broke out, and the 3 African American owners were arrested, not those who started, okay, the incident, but the African Americans were arrested. And then there was a huge mob of people who came to get these men out of prison, and they lynched these men. Okay, and so this was a horrific event that happened, and from that, Ida B. Wells would write about these lynching events. And I just want to read this one quote that I have from her. Okay, it's from a pamphlet, and I think this is where the first time I see this word, okay, creep up in African American writing. It is with no pleasure I have dipped my hands in the corruption here exposed. Somebody must show that the Afro-American race is more sinned against than sinning. And it seems to have fallen upon me to do so. And that was her mission and goal in life. So I just want really quickly to talk about how to apply this Minjang theology. And these are some ways, and we could talk about more ways, and you all could help me with this. One is to develop a Asian American theology of liberation situated in the experience of Asian Americans. And this is especially important right now that since the pandemic, there have been thousands of cases of violence against Asian Americans. And more than 100 cases of hate crimes, okay, documented legal hate crimes against Asian Americans. I had one pop up, the other day of this one white man just out of the blue, just harassing and pushing violently a Asian elderly man. Okay. So these hate crimes have come up because of the language we've used around the coronavirus. Another way is acknowledging the in-betweenness where Asians stand in our society. And I talk about some of this in my book. And in acknowledging that in-betweenness, helping Asian Americans to stand with other people of color and other non-binary persons or non-heteronormative persons. The third way is how to stop the cycle of violence between the sinners and the sin against, between the victimizers and the victims. And lastly, enabling what I had mentioned, restorative justice in individuals and communities. All right, so that's it for my presentation. This is just to help me out. If you've already bought the book and appreciate it, please send me or send Amazon a review about it. It's going to go a long way to help me. It already has in a lot of ways because I might be getting a German translation of the book sometime in the future. So with that, I will stop my presentation here so I can see all y'all lovely faces and we can have some dialogue.
Great. And I thought, thank you, Phu. So I thought as a way of transition, I might ask you a couple of questions. We could have just a moment of dialogue, and then the group can begin thinking about questions you might have. And I think our best way of doing this may be, I'm going to ask for a question or two, or we'll have a minute. And then if you have a question, you want to go next, just type your name into the chat, and then we can call on you or go to you next. And that way we won't all, speak at the same time, or you'll know when it's your turn. So.
Yeah. And by the way, I forgot to put my pronouns on there, but it's he, him, his. And so if that helps, thank you.
Thanks. So Phu, I reread the first half of the book, and I know some here have read it and some here have not read it. So I want to, there's so much in it that I think is really helpful in terms of, well, this is not a spoiler group, but Phu is drawing from the Eastern Orthodox Church, far back at the very beginnings of Christian history, and then also drawing from much more recent peoples and liberation movements. And so it feels both very rooted in tradition and then also very current and rooted in lived experience. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the book. But what I wanted to, my first quick question is, you really do such a good job, Phu, of showing how the Western or Roman Christian church, how the Church of Constantine developed, and how very different it was from the original Jesus movement and from the Eastern Orthodox Church. So, in fact, and these are some of your words, you mentioned this change from that Constantinian Christianity, once the empire made it the official religion, it changed the movement from a movement of the powerless and the disenfranchised into a more institutional church of the powerful and dominant. And I wondered if just for a minute, you unpack it much more in the book, but if you could say something to the group about
yeah. So if we know the history of of Christianity and how Christianity went from a religion of the persecuted, right? You know, even especially after 70 AD. So we had a history of Roman persecution and in Palestine. Nero and the Caesars, and they made Christians the scapegoats, and threw them into the lion's den and crucified them and tortured them. Okay, so you have this heinous history of Christianity being this minority religion of the oppressed, right? And then you have Constantine, who was waging war, trying to unify his world, as all great emperors do, and waging war against his own brothers, okay, his own family members. And he sees this sign of the cross, and he says, by this sign, I will have victory, right? And so, so he takes the sign of a cross, this executioner's symbol, right? This symbol of Roman violence to anyone who would resist Roman rule, and he takes it and makes it the symbol of his new religion. So Christianity became a religion that was appropriated. You guys have heard this word, cultural appropriation, but he appropriated this religion from this Jewish movement, primarily Jewish movement, which became a Gentile movement also. But he took this religion that was of the oppressed, and he made it the religion of the oppressor. Okay, so now to be a Roman citizen, you are also a Christian. Okay, and then he took the symbols of grace, such as the Eucharist and baptism, and he made those symbols of grace part of his institutional church, right? And so if you wanted to have those things, those means of grace, what do? You enter into communion with the Roman Church, okay? And so now Christianity has to rethink itself, right? It's no longer the religion of the oppressed, it's the religion of the dominant. And so now language has to be for the dominant, okay? So that's why, in any given church and any given Sunday, especially in the West, you go there, and the priest, she would ask the congregation to confess their sins, okay? So I'm a sinner, I sin against someone, something, somebody, and then I get absolved for my sin, right? So she gives me absolution, or I walk down the aisle, I say sinner's prayer, I'm forgiven, okay? But that's the dominant theology, because again, Christianity became the dominant religion. It was now for the sinners, okay? And so the sinners had the power to forgive their sins, okay? But then the question arises, so what happens to those who have been sinned against, okay? What happens to the people in whom I've sinned against? And that becomes pivotal, because again, no matter how you read the Gospels, you read it literally or you read it spiritually, still you see that God is on the side of the sin against, right? Those who are marginalized, those who are poor, those who are hurting, those who don't have universal health care, right? There's uninsured, and so the Spirit of God goes to liberate those who have been hurt and oppressed. And so that has been the sort of brief history of Christian of Christianity, of dominant Christianity, and so that has become sort of staple of Western Christianity, especially here in the U.S. What better theology can you have when you enter into a foreign land that's not yours, to colonize a people and to take over? What better theology than the theology of the sinner?
Yeah, I think as I reread that, I mean, I just read it also in our context here in Charleston, which is an American context, but there are a great many churches that I believe are Constantinian. They're happy with the American empire and its status quo. And there are some churches in our area which are Black liberation churches, and they are telling a very different story and practicing a different kind of faith, I think. But those, you just see them, you can see them on display where we live. I think of Houston too, and the handful of communities there, like the Live Oak Friends meeting or the Houston Zen Center Mennonite Church, who are doing very radically different things, but they were so small compared to just what was really on most every corner. One other quick question, and group, you can start to add your name if you have a comment, a question, a thought for this discussion. You had also such a good discussion of Rene Descartes and the Cartesian dualism that developed, and the dangers of splitting, I think, the soul away from embodied experience. So we don't have, there's a much better treatment of this in the book, but I thought, I just read it and again thought of where we are as a country, and of all the dangers of leaving your body behind, and here where we live, there's a lot of religious practice, but there are a lot of bodies that are suffering, and in every kind of way, in all the ways you mentioned. And then of course, every city has its stories of Black people killed by the police. So I just wondered if you wanted to
I can be audacious and sum up Western philosophy up in a couple of sentences. But all my friends, I would say, I try to do audacious things in my book. But so Descartes becomes this problem of Western philosophy. So Western theology merged with Western philosophy, and the key person is Rene Descartes, primarily because this separation of mind and body that goes back to Gnosticism, this constant trying to say that the material, the body is corrupted and evil, and we need to be liberated, from the body through knowledge, through secret knowledge. And Rene Descartes didn't do anything too special, but he reinvigorated those ideas in the West. And so where we have this a lot is something like evangelicalism, right? Where we have, like, these are the tenets in which you have to believe in order to be an evangelical. So you either believe them or you don't. And so whenever I was teaching at the Baptist University here in Houston, where I no longer teach anymore. I would often try to talk about ethics. Okay, what do we do with faith? And it's like it was very foreign to a lot of my evangelical students. This concept of ethics, because ethics has to do with embodied principles, right? How do we live out the good for people? How do we live together in a society? How do we relate to one another? How do we practice things that will be good to self and other, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one way that Cartesian dualism has affected Christianity. This sort of stripping of the body, and the other way is then in the language, in the rhetoric, right? So we have language like I can't. Are we all the same? Isn't it what's in your heart that matters? Language that's very disembodied, colorblind language that again obfuscates the essence that if the body did not matter, then why were Africans in particular enslaved? Why were Black people brought here? Why weren't other bodies brought here, right? Why was there a indigenous trail of tears in particular? Why were there in particular Japanese bodies in internment camps? So if that didn't matter, then why wouldn't it? But then the flip side of the rhetoric is, well, no, that doesn't matter. If you look at color or anything, that's racist, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so there's this language that comes out of that. Again, the de-emphasis on our particular relations to one another that is embodied in community as bodied persons. So those are just some of the ways in which Descartes has crept in there and disembodied a lot of Western theology. And so if you can't talk about the body, who can you talk about as being the sin against, right? Who are the sin against in particular? No. And that's the difficult thing about philosophy like Descartes. There's no particularity in any of it, because it is disembodied in general.
Right.
I hope that helps, Jeremy.
It does. I mean, I think for where all of us live, and for this moment, if we discount the bodies of anyone, then we discount the bodies of people who are really suffering. We discount the bodies of, well, in our case, the birds, the plants. We discount all the bodies of all that's real. And I think I just really appreciate how you drew us back to some older sources where we can revere what is right here, what is right now, and we don't get lost in our minds imagining something or somewhere else. And it was kind of a delight to be reminded that that is a part of the Christian tradition too, when so much of what we see is this Constantinian, Cartesian, all this stuff in our minds. Meanwhile, the bodies of the earth just suffer all around us. So okay, so we have, excuse me, we have one question that we can go to. Deborah, would you like to say your question, or would you like me to share it? Where are you?
Is Deborah on the line?
Well, the question, there you are. I don't want anyone to feel put on the spot.
You're on mute, Deborah. I can't hear your lovely voice.
I'm using my iPad because my computer has imploded. So I'm not very good with this. But my question was, do you view any positivity with your experience of Christianity on the fear of white people in the United States today? I don't know if I'm really articulating very well what I mean, but is there any positivity that you can bring through your theology to what is happening with the groups, and where we might go from here, or what we can do to make it better?
Okay, I think I'm getting your question, but may I just repeat? So your question, Deborah, is, do I see anything positive that I could help people, especially white people who have certain fears, perhaps about like different groups, to help move things along? Is
Yes.
that what you're asking? Okay.
Yes, it is.
No, that's a excellent question. So I've been part of a group that is against nationalism and xenophobia, because I mentioned especially this idea of xenophobia, this anti-Chinese sort of rhetoric, right? So at the beginning of this pandemic, we heard the words, Kung flu, or China virus, and what that has evolved into is this hatred of Asians, in particular Chinese, but it's like, for a lot of white people, they're not gonna, distinguish me from a Chinese person, right? And so, there is that impending fear now, but there is this historical fear of Black bodies, which again comes from this narrative, this narrative by the sinners about the sin against. I was telling one of my colleagues shared in a meeting about how, and she's African American and married to a gentleman from the islands, and so they go into a refrigerator, a appliance store, to shop, and throughout this whole time they're being eyed by a white salesperson. Okay, and she's thinking, okay, how am I going to steal a refrigerator from the store? Okay, but she's constantly being told, not asked, may I help you with with your shopping, constantly being followed. So she shares this experience of it, and I come up to her and I say, that's so strange. This sort of projection, right? This sort of projection that African American people, are out there to steal, when we have, a history, okay, of white colonization, taking of lands, taking of property, taking of people, and I gave her the example of the 2008 stock market crash. I said, no, it wasn't like there was a bunch of like inner city hoodlums that got together and said, we're gonna buy these short sales on stocks or what, and like bankrupt the economy by trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars, and rob people's, accounts and mortgages. Okay. No, these were done by white collar, traders. Okay. Who bankrupt our economy. Okay. So there's this history, okay, of where like I should be fearing white people are like clutching my wallet closely when I see a white person like walking down the street. Okay, that should be the narrative, but it's not the narrative. Okay, so how do we move, beyond this in a positive way? Well, I again, without shifting, okay, whether it be theologically or socially or politically, the emphasis, from the oppressors or the sinners to the sin against and the oppressed, without doing that and being in solidarity with those people, I don't think we can move forward. I think we continue to sow the seeds of sin, that theological word, in our nation. We constantly will. Abel is constantly being killed, and Abel's blood constantly cries out. We're doing this over and over again. This is the nightmare that we've been living in America, but we call it a dream, and we're selling the American dream on that. So until we shift, and being on the side of the oppressed, I think then those white people who are Christians will understand, because once we can end the cycle of violence, it's not just good for those who are oppressed, it's good for everyone. No, right. It's good for all of us to have this peace, to live not in fear, but in community, and in kinship with one another.
Thank you. And I just, what you're reminding me of is that my deceased father fought in the Korean War, and he was an entrenched Southerner. And when he returned from the war, and I was little, but I remember vividly thinking when he came back, he just had a hatred of not Koreans, but Chinese and Japanese. And I realized that he didn't even know the difference between those cultures. And I think about that because my son's girlfriend is Chinese, and she's absolutely lovely. And her parents speak very, very broken English. And the whole thing just seems so, I don't want to use the word hopeless, but it makes me feel like we're just so far apart from each other. And that, what's necessary is for us to really make an effort on a constant basis to make sure that we're not far from each other in the way that my father was. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, thank you. Tyler, I think you're next in the queue.
Sure. And thank you again, Dr. Luu. It's really just a pleasure and a delight to hear from you and to meet you. I'm making my way through your book, so this is exciting to meet the author. I have a question asking for resources, whether theological or philosophical or even poetic or narrative. I really appreciated your shift to thinking about the sinned against. And it was a very, I think, novel idea because there's this extreme flattening of moral agents. The verse, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God," comes to mind. I think maybe one of the more extreme times I've heard it, there was somebody who was working in ministry, and he said that if he cheated on his wife, that would be a sin, but it wasn't a sin against his wife; it was a sin against God. So her hurt was really irrelevant in that action, which is just really hard to understand. So when we've flattened everything and said, like, whoa, we're all sinners here, and when we've removed other people as people who have been hurt and harmed, and instead it's this human and divine relationship that's in peril, I think it's just really hard to move towards an ethic of justice and an ethic of restoration. So with this thought that I think might be pretty dominant in American Christianity, of just we're all sinners, maybe even all lives matter. What sort of resources do you have to help bring us back towards a holistic ethic?
No, that's great. Gosh, there are, it's hard to there are a lot of theological resources that I could recommend. There, and Jeremy can share with you if you don't have the discussion guide that I published after the book, because people were asking questions like that. So we have resources there. There are a lot of theological resources, such as the work of Andrew Sung Park, who's sort of the pioneer of doing this Minjang theology and theology of Han here in the U.S. He's a Methodist theologian and was very helpful to me. There's not a lot, I hate to say, of work sort of like what I'm doing. I hate to make myself like the trailblazer in this, but if you're conscious to do the work of reading the liberation theologians, you read your James Cone, you read you read poetry by people like Ocean Vuong. You read people like Vic Thanh Nguyen. You read that literature. It's gonna emerge. It's probably not gonna emerge in the same ways that my work has emerged, but it is in the fabric of our culture, because we've just been so hurt, right? We've been so hurt, especially these past 4 years. But again, it's not just these past 4 years. These past 4 years are symptomatic. It's all symptomatic of the continual hurt that has been happening in the U.S. So I'll say that Tyler, I'll send you my discussion guide, and you can have those resources there. So yeah, like, read Exit Wounds by Ocean Vuong. That's an amazing book. The other thing is how you alluded to the passage about, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's taken from Isaiah and used by the Apostle Paul. When I do this kind of presentation, especially in Methodist and Baptist churches, I talk about how the Apostle Paul, his life, he saw himself as who? The Pharisee among the Pharisee, the sinner among the sinners, right? And so when he saw himself that way, he acknowledged, that he was once, the sinner, and he was persecuting Christians, the sin against. And so when he writes that in Romans, well, he was, for him as a Pharisee, he was perfect, right? He was holy, he was the pious, and other people were the sinners, right? As a Pharisee. And when he was writing in Romans, he was saying, and you have to, again, you have to be a good exegete, like your pastor Jeremy, to read Romans correctly, right? You got to see Romans as being a letter to a congregation or congregations with two audiences: one, a Jewish audience, and one, a Gentile audience, right? And so he's saying, we Jews who consider ourselves to be sinless people, God, holy, one holy nation, right? We are to reach those Gentiles out there who we consider what? The sinners, right? The sinners. And so then he goes into this rhetoric. All of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And therefore, the conclusion is we must go and reach those sinners, outside. So that's the plain rhetoric of the book of Romans, okay? But reading it on a superficial level, you don't get there. But the same thing applies to what you alluded to, Tyler, the idea that, all lives matter. Again, if particular lives didn't matter in particular, then no lives matter, right? Then no lives matter. If there are not particular sin against folks, then really all of us have sinned means no one has sinned. No one has done harm to each other, right? So again, it takes some work. It doesn't take a lot of work. It takes some work, right? But it takes sitting down and having this conversation. I wish more people can sit down with someone like you, Tyler, and just have conversations like that, and they could just listen and be informed of that. But it takes those conversations. It's hard, and some people are not ready. Now, I'm at a school that is, on the surface, a progressive Episcopalian school. We check up all the boxes, of, progressive Episcopalian. But below the surface, no, there are a lot of people who don't get it. And so many conversations have to be talked, have to be discussed about these issues, and some people don't get it, and some people need to be avoided. Some people, you see the value in having some time, with and giving your time, and so yeah, it's a huge question, but you're a young man, Tyler, and you got your life to deal with this, and so like I'm 100% like behind you in this work.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. See, our hope is in young people like Tyler.
Right. We have officially arrived in midlife.
Yeah.
When we can say that.
Yeah, didn't I tell you, Jeremy? I'm retiring next week, so it's like.
Well, and Phu, what part of we're coming to more questions, but I think part of what the book does so strongly in the first half, and we'll talk about the second half next time, is really show how deeply embedded some incredibly harmful ideas are in American Christianity and in the Christianity that many of us grew up with. And the ideas were worse than we knew. Even those of us who have left those expressions of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so, friends, if you read the book, it's kind of astonishing how bad some of the ideas, how harmful they are, and how much harm they could create or how much wounding they can do. But it's also, as we move toward part two, there are really helpful resources too that weren't always emphasized. And so that's where we're heading. And Nara, I want to make sure to go to you next. You were waiting in the queue.
I just wanted to say thank you first for being here. I have not had a chance to read your book because I didn't know about this until today, but I'm going to get it. But you brought up the in-betweenness, and I really identified with that as being a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. And I wondered, I kind of view it as like, because I'm also a member of privilege, because I am a white American, I feel this desire often to kind of connect with these other groups of in-betweeners and also be like a representative, being somewhere out there on the front lines in order to have a voice where people can't. But I wondered how you thought maybe we could bring these different groups of in-betweeners together, and unify them in order to help heal more and have a bigger effect on the society. And also, kind of two-part is, I wonder what your thought was if this goes unanswered, like if we continue with all of this oppression long term. I wonder what your thoughts are on how it could affect not just here in America. Clearly we're struggling a lot, but also the world as a whole. I wonder if we don't heal, how detrimental you think. I mean, clearly it would be, but just what your viewpoint is on that.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. Inara, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Inara. Okay, here, Inara, another young person who we will all support. And so when you say, how can we get together in-betweeners like yourselves? I would say that you are the start of that. And Jeremy, would back me on this, commission you to go out and do this kind of work. This is the time to do it, to get people who are like you and Nara together to have these discussions, to mobilize ways in which the wounded in your communities can be heard, that you can be with, to hear them, that you could not so much empower, but you could see, the God image, the divine image in them, and also to form those connections, those intimate connections. It's only in those moments of kinship, I can use Father G's words, those moments of kinship, those moments of togetherness, where you can build, community and a movement that can resist okay, resist the continuation of Han in this world, right? Because believe it or not, like where we are now, like because I'm sure if we weren't in a pandemic, like I would be there with your congregation, you know, in South Carolina, right? I would be there. But all that we have been experiencing is a result of this Han, right? This split. You know, how split can we be between mind and body? I'm seeing you on the other side of my screen, you know, in my screen as these separate cells. You know, if you read Descartes' Meditation, he talks about that. Not knowing if, you know, the automatons that walk, you know, past his windows are real or not, you know? So we have denied the science of this pandemic. We're here, we're apart, we're masked up. Like today, I was walking through the gym, and you know, and my students were waving hi to me, and there's like Dr. Luu. They want to give me hugs, and one young lady gave me a hug, and I said, thank you. I did not know who she was, okay, because she had on a mask. Okay, she was, and I said, thank you. I was about to say, and who are you? Okay, so we are just so separated by all this. Is rooted in the Han. Is rooted in this dualism. Is rooted in not understanding who the sin against are. It's rooted in continuing to sow the seeds of Han by the oppressors, by the sinners, and so this is the result. Like we got it, you know, here. So to come back to your question, I again, I would start grassroots to form communities of people who can express it through the art, through their poetry, through literature, through whatever means, whatever language, to get this out into the world. And so it starts with you, Inara, and that's why I'm full of hope. Another young person. I can definitely retire next week, Jeremy, because we have these young people here to take our place.
Well, and also, hopefully, and that's what church is for as well. I mean, that some truth telling, some gathering, some welcoming in and making space. And at the moment, you know, out of respect and love for each other's bodies, we're not meeting in person, but in our we're starting to, I think, be able to allow smaller groups with masks outside, and then we'll do some reentry. So whatever the church can be and do, that's what it's for. There are, let's see, I think Ben Tennille is next, and we have until about 8:30. So I want to make sure if you have a question, go ahead and put your name in the queue, but it's a really wonderful dialogue. So Ben, you're next.
Yeah. I wanted to share with you a tweet that perhaps Dr. Luu can make use of in the future. I read a tweet about a week ago, which went sort of like this. Now, when I'm introduced to someone and they tell me they're a Christian, I respond, classical Jesus or contemporary Jesus? And I think that's a good way for us to raise that issue with people, or at least get them to think about it. The other thing that came to mind is Jeremy's got me reading a little Howard Thurman, and I'm reminded of Thurman's view that he really didn't claim to be a Christian, but to be a follower of Jesus. And it sounds, in reading Dr. Luu's book, that there's a lot of Howard Thurman in that approach. If maybe Jeremy, you could comment on that, or Dr. Luu could if he's familiar with Howard Thurman as well.
I'll give it to you, Jeremy.
I think there's I think Thurman is so poetically renders the difference between what passes for Christianity, what is institutionally or conventionally so, and then the real teachings of Jesus and trying to put those teachings into practice. One thing that has always struck me funny in my life is that people think I'm far to the left or politicized or this or that. I don't think I'm anything. I'm just occasionally putting those teachings into practice, and it makes me stand out, but the teachings will speak for themselves, and the way kind of you follow it and you just end up somewhere where you don't fit in. I think that's a good thing, but Ben, the only other thing I wanted to add is Cornel West has a wonderful discussion of what he calls Constantinian Christianity, which is basically the Christianity of empire, which he would say is, much of certainly white evangelicalism in this country. And that book was called Democracy Matters. It was published actually like right after the re-election of George W. Bush. I remember when I read it. So I was feeling the weight of empire at that time in a particular way. But Democracy Matters, if you want to take a deeper dive into his description of Constantinian. Also, Phuc does a really wonderful job of showing how the empire co-opted something, and it doesn't take many steps to realize that our empire is still doing it. That always happens. And Phuc, you may want to add a.
No. I'm trying to recall the book, Jesus of the Disinherited. Is that Thurman's book? The classical Jesus, and by classical, if we mean the Palestinian itinerant rabbi who sought to heal, those who were sick and restore the impoverished and sought for liberation. If that's what is meant by the classical Jesus, I'm all there. It really is tough when we think about ways in which Jesus and the Christ is used in Western Christianity, and it's mainly as a symbol or tool to keep the status quo, right? To keep things as they are. Those in power, those who have privilege, those who are of a certain class and a certain race on the top. But if we again go back to the particular Jesus, this Palestinian itinerant rabbi who sided with the sin against, then we have to reframe Christianity very differently, right? And so then even in a denomination that I'm loosely a part of now, like the Episcopal denomination, it's got a lot of the contemporary Jesus, right? The colonized Jesus, and it's hard. The language is already like the Church of England, like embedded the language in the Book of Common Prayer for a certain type of colonial Christianity. It's hard to get away from that, But if we come back again constantly to the sin against, I think we can escaped those clutches. I'll maybe answer one more question very quickly, and if I may, Jeremy, I close with like a very short reading.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. John, are you raising your hand? John Dawson, if you unmute yourself, how about you can have our last question?
Could you unmute, John?
I've got it. Yeah.
Awesome.
I put a question in chat, but basically it was, I mean, I was just reading earlier today about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And Bishop Tutu was saying that in that situation, he felt you either had to have peace at the expense of justice or justice at the expense of peace. And he said that the truth and reconciliation, when the oppressors confronted the oppressed, and the oppressed were able to describe how they felt, and the oppressors also described how they oppressed. Now, I don't know how they brought that about, but and I thought that was relevant to what we're saying. And the other thing is your insight about, if I understood you correctly, are you saying that sinners make the best colonizers or the best oppressors because we've already been forgiven of our sins by the institution, and so we are more free to oppress? And is that not what American exceptionalism amounts to?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, white guilt can be such a dangerous thing. You know, it's such a dangerous thing. It can drive people to not be aware of the other, and then therefore just seek to alleviate that guilt, right? You know, and so, you know, Paul Tillich says this very well. You know, Tillich would talk about, you know, what is the purpose of Christ's atonement, and one of the reasons that he outlines is to alleviate guilt. Well, that's American Christianity right there, right? Both, you know, Protestant and Roman Catholic, this alleviating of guilt, which centers upon ourselves, right, but not centered upon those who are sinned against. And so, yeah, and your other part about the peace, if you have justice, it might, yeah, because peace doesn't necessarily mean the absence of conflict, right? And so when we confront the powers, there's going to be a clash, right? There's going to be a clash. And so that's why, you know, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is always criticized by sowing conflict. Now, everywhere you go, you know, there's violence, you know, it seems like. So yes, but only in that conflict can the oppressors have the ability to see who they are, right? To see how they unleash the dogs and the fire hydrants and the fire hoses and the rubber bullets and the tear gas on protesters, right? So only in conflict can the oppressors really have the ability to see that, and some still don't see it. But again, you know, after January 6th, okay, there was okay, in that conflict, you know, which is a different kind of conflict. Even after that, some people were horrified enough, you know, to say, no, I'm not going to be on that side of it, you know. That's something to think about. It's not advocating of violence, but when we talk about peace, we have to think about what kind of peace are we talking about, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
So this, yes, this is not to spoil things. Jeremy already gave a spoiler alert, but this is a section of the book called Death, Sin, and Han, and I talk about this idea of death towards the end. But death is one of the things that the Eastern Fathers really wanted to clarify as something that humanity has always tried to resolve, and how Jesus in a lot of ways answers the question of death through his resurrected bodily life. Okay, and again, you don't have to take any of that literally. I mean, that's the spiritual meaning is as important or not, or even more important. But it's this conquering of death that leads to the abolition of the idea of scarcity. Okay, so I'll read this just a few pages, and then we can conclude. And then next time I'll look forward to seeing y'all and hearing more questions. Death, sin, and Han are interwoven into an intricate tapestry that makes up the air we all breathe. It is clear that God, as well as God's creation, is on the side of life. Sin occurs when we give in to the pull of death, to all that seeks to destroy life. As sociologist and educator Parker Palmer observes, we engage in practices that are either death-dealing or life-giving. We live within the creative tension of these two polarities. Death-dealing choices become quick fixes in a culture characterized by addiction, obsession with celebrity and power, and an attraction towards destruction rather than creation. Yet within death-dealing options, there is a semblance of life. In some ways, it's easier to tear down than to build up. At least tearing down gives us some purpose. This is the Nietzschean option, to seek meaning in violence towards others and the self. Sin propagates in the cycle where suffering, longing, and desire are not transformed. Destruction multiplies and spirals down towards death. We know this from observing the consequences. A trail of destruction, lost relationships, hurt, and responsibility borne by those who did not cause the harm, the loneliness and isolation that we encounter at the end of each day. I've known too many leaders, seemingly successful professionals, who live this kind of existence. Among them are clergy, lawyers, doctors, engineers, teachers, and others who have all become accomplished in the act of doing, but not in the art of being. Neither human nor being is a part of their agenda. But our vocations, our callings are much higher than merely to work and earn money and exist. Building up requires that we creatively do something with life, a life that involves difficulty, pain, and suffering, but also joy and hope. Death is neither the final victor nor the last word. Within all of us is that light that shines into the darkness. And this light is ignited by the possibility of moving into the space of creative suffering. When we examine the Han in our own lives and find healing for ourselves and others, we find a canvas for a life of meaning and creativity. For those who have sinned against others, this is also the intersection where we find repentance and new ways forward. Jesus was always helping people turn from death to life. Death is most often the looming experience of something we cannot do anything about, the final mark of our mortality and finiteness, our utter dependency and vulnerability. If we take the Eastern Fathers' view that sin is the result of our passions, our feelings in reaction to death, then we can see that much of our destructive behavior is a response to death. We feel helpless about death. We act out of this fear of impending death, a fear that is intimately related to a sense of scarcity, the perception that life is limited. We sense that there is not enough time to do what we want to do, nor enough resources. Control, power over others, attention-seeking, and all sorts of malicious acts towards others and self center on these death-dealing decisions. For both the sinner and the sin against, Jesus offers liberation from our fixation on dispelling the assaults and insults of death from our lives. For sinners, Christ offers freedom to love and therefore to be loved. For the sin against, he offers empowerment to choose to confront, forgive, receive vocation, celebrate blessing, grieve, create peace, and engage in all sorts of life-giving acts. The Spirit offers the sin against the way of dawn, a Korean term that means to cut off. This is a strategy to prevent further hurt and end the cycle of sin. As a victim to the Roman cross, a rabbi shunned by his own religious tradition, a man constantly questioned about his pedigree, the son of a day-laboring carpenter, Jesus provides a way to live boldly in the world with authority and wholeness of being. A picture of my uncle, my father's younger brother, hangs on a wall in my parents' home as a part of a makeshift altar. His black and white picture is almost a mirror of my appearance. During my late 20s, I looked almost exactly like him. Not many years after that picture was taken, his life was ended by the war. My uncle was serving in the South Vietnamese army when his boat hit a mine. He was instantly killed. Each time I see that picture, I wonder what kind of life he would have had if war had not been taken his life, whether he would have had a family and children. Then I reflect on my life and wonder how much of it I have wasted and whether I am making the most of what has been given to me, is given to me in each day and each breath. Growing up in the United States, every move from state to state and town to town seemed like another ending of my life. Each move meant the end of friendships, end of love. These experiences of loss and grief are sewn deeply into my soul. They brought feelings of abandonment, eternal abandonment, God abandonment, over and over again. My grief was the grief of a low Asian boy who met and played with a white girl in kindergarten and then several weeks later had to leave the school because his parents had to move to find work. The little boy left his first childhood love. The life I lived as a child is the migratory life of people whose lives were torn apart by war, people who have to piece themselves back together again and again. When every departure and every change in relationship smells of death, why risk the pain of venturing into new experiences and journeys? Experience has made me wary, but also hopeful. I am deeply aware of both the impermanence of life and the strength of new life, renewed life. Life is insistent in overcoming death. This insistence has been built into nature and also into the way God is at work within the world, within us and through us. At a poetry reading, my now good friend D.F. Brown recalled the trauma of the Vietnam War as an American vet. In Binh Dinh Blues, Brown recites lyrics about a particular area, memories of which return again and again. Bobbing in the waves off Quy Nhon, central coast of always, always. After the reading, I told him that I was born in Quy Nhon during the same time that he was stationed in Binh Dinh province. I'm glad you made it here, my friend, Brown told me. I'm glad we both made it here, I said. We shook hands and embraced.
Amen.
So guys, it's only the kinship that we all share with each other that makes it possible, all of us together.
Yeah, thanks. Phu, thanks so much for being with us at the end of a long teaching day and spending your time with us. And friends, we will meet for the second half of this discussion and going into some places where we can continue talking about how healing may be won. And that will be 1 month from tonight. So March the 24th, we'll send out information, but thank you to everyone for being here. And thanks especially to Phu, and love to all in Houston and
Thank you.
around Texas and other places who are recovering tonight.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it so much. Guys, it's been a lovely evening. And if you have any other questions, like if I cut you off in the discussion, either save them for next time or ask for my email. And people as far as Germany, Berlin have contacted me about my book. So I'll make time for y'all. Okay. So thank you from Texas.
Yeah.
Have a great night.
Thanks all. Good night.